Richard, how long have you been involved with IAFOR?
For 3 years. I came 3 years ago as a keynote speaker and came back last year with a couple of my faculty members, and we had a panel presentation as kind of the keynote of that session, and came back this year just to sit in the audience and watch. And it's always fun to be here, and you know, it's interesting what happens here, with especially this becomes a real great venue for young faculty members to present their research, which they often can't do in giant venues. So this is great for them.
In 2011, you gave a keynote speech. What was that about?
I was talking about the Arab Spring and how the media really in the Gulf and the broader Middle East covered it, and how social media, the new media, really drove the Arab Spring.
What's your background, professional background?
Well, my background is really as a journalist and a newspaper journalist. I started off as a kind of a general assignment reporter in Buffalo, New York, back in 1971, and a few weeks later I found myself involved in the famous prison riot at Attica, New York, and I was inside the prison for 3 or 4 days before what turned out to be the bloodiest confrontation among Americans since Antietam. And after that, I got into being, I was an investigative reporter for a while, but I drifted sooner or later into being a financial writer. And so I spent a lot of time in Wall Street and other things like that. Then the newspaper went out of business, and I came to a crossroads as to, I wanted to do journalism. I was offered a job in television, but really at some point couldn't find myself doing that. So I went off to Indiana to be editor-in-chief of a newspaper, middle-sized newspaper, and did that for, I don't know, 6 years, I think. And then I kind of serendipitously fell into academia at DePaul University, where you and I met, and I was there for, I guess, 7 years, at which point I'd been tenured, and I found myself in the business of teaching these students about a world of journalism that I realized didn't exist anymore. The internet had come along, and so I left there and went to the Wall Street Journal in New York to become part of the editing team for its then new online division. And I did that a while, and then went to Northwestern in 1998, and been there for, I guess, 16 years, 15 years. And so I kind of, both newspaper journalism and the teaching of it.
Which do you enjoy the best, professional side or the teaching?
Wow. I don't know. I think, I guess the teaching part, because I now can influence young people to go do this new kind of journalism and new technologies of journalism. Though I must say that when I was a young reporter, those were kind of the best days of my life, and better than being editor-in-chief. And right now, you know, being a dean is one thing, but I like the teaching part better than sitting in office shuffling paper.
What's it like in the Middle East?
Well, it's way different than I thought it would be back in 2008 when I went there. I'd lived this kind of notion of my view of the world while I'd traveled. My view of the Middle East, anyway, was colored by my colleagues, the press in the U.S., and there's so much conservative information and misinformation that I've gotten there, and I found the people to be lovely, the religion to be a real force in their lives. Islam is something that is demonized so much in the U.S., but one gets there and finds that these people actually stop and pray 5 times a day, and they live their lives around their beliefs. And yes, there are certainly people who read the Quran the wrong way or a different way, and they become, over the top. But the same is true, I think, in Christianity in the U.S. anyway, with the right-wing Christians. So, but I've just really come to enjoy it, and from a personal side, this where I am situated in Qatar is kind of like the center of the world. So I've been able to visit so many places that when I lived in Chicago, I had to go to New Delhi a couple of times from there, and it was like an all-night 18-hour flight or something. And now I can be in New Delhi in under 2.5 hours, and I'm in Istanbul in 3 hours. And I've been all kinds of places, down to East Africa, down to Dar es Salaam and Zanzibar and to Kenya in 5 hours, 5-hour flight. I couldn't do these things from what I used to believe Chicago is the epicenter of the world. One could always fly nonstop from Chicago to any place in the world, but it was also 14 or 18 hours of doing it. So it's been great.
Now, Dr. Brad Ham gave the keynote speech today for the MediAsia FilmAsia 2013. And it sounds like there's a new direction that Northwestern is taking. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I'd say that Brad's biggest idea, the one that he brings to the school, is that he believes every undergraduate student there should spend time outside the United States, at least 2 weeks for a short program, or go away for 10 or 20 weeks and get involved in something. I think it's a genius, big idea that if he can pull it off, if he can raise the funds for it. So many Americans don't travel outside the U.S. and right now, only 40% of Americans have passports, and of those, half of those people with passports are over age 60. And a lot of those who have passports only gotten them recently so they could go now to Canada or Mexico. It used to be you didn't need a passport for that. And so Brad wants them to have the cultural and intellectual opportunities to travel, to come to Asia particularly is of interest to him. So I think that's a great idea, a big idea. He's also very much aware of the need to get students involved in the new media, the new technologies, because they are ever changing. And so he wants to still teach them journalism, but he wants them to all learn all of the things. Why is it I'm a newspaper man? But if I were a newspaper student today, he would say, that's not enough. You also have to be a television student. You have to learn how to use television. You have to learn all of those things. So, yes, things are changing, and the school is changing. It ought to be ahead of the curve, but it needs to catch up really fast and then be ahead. But I think he's way ahead in this notion of these international experiences for students.
What would you say to students now or aspiring journalists about the future?
Well, I would say that the future of journalism is probably greater than it's ever been. There's so much of the world is now open. Gosh, we can go to Burma now. And everybody in some ways becomes a journalist, but it becomes more important for people to be trained in such a way that we can verify. And that's kind of the new part of journalism. Verifiability is, I guess, the thing that the internet has brought to us. Dan Rather couldn't verify what he had to say, and he lost his job as perhaps the most famous news anchor in the United States. He went on the air, made some statements, and there were bloggers all over the country within hours proving him wrong. So we teach our students about verifying what they have. And if you can't verify it, you just can't go with it. And so that's the big change in journalism brought to us by the internet.
I guess my last question is, you talk about verification and bloggers, but how do we know as journalists what we're getting from freelance photographers, videographers, freelance writers, bloggers? How do we know that that's accurate?
We don't always, and one sees, you know, there aren't any or many journalists who are involved in Syria right now, who can get in and do things. And if they can, these journalists have had to use iPhones to capture their video. At the beginning, they didn't know they had to turn it horizontal, but they figured it out after a while because they weren't trained in it. They were trained to be some other kind of journalist, and they were suddenly handed an iPhone and said, this is the only way you're going to get it. But there's a lot of video that comes out of there. There was a lot of video out of Tunisia at first, and those networks that used it took a chance. They usually went on and said, this is a video we can't verify. And you have to tell the public that. It's either it is or it isn't. But there are, there are a lot of people who've planted stories wrongly, falsehoods with the press, and if they can get away with it, they will. So the press needs to figure out how to verify. And, there are ways of doing that, triangulating through not just taking what somebody gives you as a source, but finding someone else who was perhaps a witness to the same thing, and they would describe it in the same way and so forth. But it's a big problem, but there are a lot of people out there with cameras and cell phones and just taking pictures. Can you fake a picture? Look, we've been faking pictures in history since, in the U.S., Honest Abe, of all people, Abraham Lincoln, they faked a picture of him using a senator's body, Senator John C. Calhoun. Lincoln liked this pose, and so they took Lincoln's head and put it onto Calhoun's body. And this was before Photoshop, and it was still nicely done. One could hardly tell. So this has been going on for forever, and now people have a chance and ability to do it in almost a seamless way. They can move a character in and out of a scene, and it's hard, but there are techniques for, I think, detecting it, and it's a problem, but it's our future, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to be here, and hope I can come to IAFOR many more times.